In this episode, a 54-year-old grandmother leaves home to work in the rubber plantations, never to be seen alive again. 2 days later, locals and security personnel make a shocking discovery. A grossly engorged reticulated python is having difficulty moving in the undergrowth. Its bulging tummy is a dead giveaway. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying story of Jahrah, swallowed whole by a python. Welcome to Final Affliction. Jahrah was a 54-year-old grandmother. She lived with her family in the village of Jahrah on the Indonesian island of Sumatra. On the 21st of October, 2022, she said goodbye to her family and headed off to work for the day. Jahrah worked in the rubber plantations for decades. Her hours were long and arduous, working through the scorching midday sun. Her job was a trapper. This involved using a knife to cut diagonal lines in the rubber tree bark. Milky white liquid would drip from the cuts she made, which she collected in small plastic cups or coconut shells. The plantation was huge. Row upon row of rubber trees stood as far as the eye could see. Since the year 2000, Indonesia has lost 18% of its tree cover. Deforestation clears ground for agriculture. In the Jambi province where Jahrah worked in the southeast of the island, rice, corn, tobacco, palm oil, and rubber were produced on a massive scale. The plantations are surrounded by beautiful countryside. In Jambi, the Barisan Mountains and volcanic peaks protrude from the evergreen forests. The lush green valleys are filled with tidal rivers and scattered with mangrove swamps. This habitat is home to a plethora of native wildlife, all of which is competing with an ever-expanding human population. Jahrah left her home before dawn. The world outside her little house was dark. Only the moon provided a sliver of light for her to see her way through the dense jungle and towards the plantation. Jahrah earned the equivalent of £1.25 a day. With an extra job on the side and working 7 days a week, Jahrah managed a monthly salary of just £45 or $55. There was no job security at the plantation. Despite having worked there for over a decade, Jahrah, like many other workers, was still only employed on a day labor basis and had no formal contract or benefits that would go with that. After Jahrah had signed in at the plantation that morning, she set to work. She held her knife tight against each tree and made the diagonal incisions. She was focused on the job at hand, waiting until the milky white rubber began flowing before tying her collection beaker underneath it and moving on to the next tree. She didn't hear a stealthy predator approaching her, but suddenly she felt an incredible pain on her back. It was a sharp stabbing pain that made her jump forwards. She dropped her knife in the commotion and felt something wrapped tightly around her body. To her utter horror, a 22-foot-long snake had wrapped itself around Jahrah's body. Its thick, muscular coil squeezed tighter and ever tighter. Jahrah gasped as she was pulled to the ground. She took a deep breath as the pressure built around her body. She couldn't move. Her arms were pinned down by her side. The giant snake had taken her completely by surprise. It had ambushed her in the dawn light. She stood no chance of fighting back. The more she wriggled to free herself, the more the snake tightened its suffocating grip. She desperately tried to wriggle free. Her sandals came off her feet as she tried to kick the snake. Her headscarf fell from her head and landed silently to the ground. Jahrah felt her lungs about to burst. The snake was squeezing so tightly that she couldn't exhale. In a few agonizing minutes, Jahrah was dead. It was a tragedy. She died alone with no one aware of the horror she was suffering. She had worked every day of her adult life to provide for her family, and they were unlikely to receive any form of compensation for their devastating loss. When Jahrah no longer struggled, when her body lay still and her heart stopped beating, the snake released its grip. It uncoiled itself from around Jahrah and slithered towards her head. With its unblinking eyes, it stretched the elastic ligaments holding its lower jaw to its skull, and its mouth opened wide, wider than its own head, wider than Jahrah's head. Then it started consuming her. Inching its mouth over her body, it enveloped the young grandmother, swallowing her further and further down, working its way over her head, over her shoulders, and down towards her feet. During the course of the day, the snake became severely engorged as it managed to fit Jahrah's entire body inside its stomach. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes in the world. They typically range from 1.5 meters in length to 6.5 meters, approximately 5 to 25 feet. But reports of them exceeding these lengths, such as the one that killed Jahrah, are common. They can weigh as much as 75 kilograms or 165 pounds. At the end of the day, when Jahrah didn't return home, her husband became worried. He went out searching for her. He followed the usual path she took through the undergrowth to the rubber plantation. She hadn't checked out of work that day. Her husband scouted the plantation, walking down the long rows of trees and calling out her name. Then he came across Jahrah's jacket on the ground. Next to it lay her sandals and knife. He picked them up and looked around. He called out again, but the silence was deafening. He knew something terrible must have happened to her. He ran back to the village and called for people to help him search. A group followed him to the rubber plantation. As darkness fell, they continued to look for Jahrah. It was only at 2 a.m. that Jahrah's husband reluctantly gave up searching for the night and returned home. He reported his wife missing to the local police the next day. They, along with security officials, joined in the search. He took them to the spot where he found Jahrah's belongings lying on the ground. The search continued. Reports suggested that it wasn't until 2 days later that one of the locals made a shocking discovery. An enormous 7-meter-long snake was laying in the grass. It could barely move. Its body was grossly bulging. One of the locals severed its head, killing it there and then. They dragged it into a clearing. A crowd gathered around. Under the order of Police Chief HORRIFYING, someone took out another knife and ran it along the length of the snake's body, cutting it from head to tail. As the snake opened up, Jahrah's body spilled out onto the ground. She was completely intact. It was a terrifying shock for the onlookers. Something that would haunt her family for the rest of their days. To know that a loved one had been completely consumed by a giant snake was the stuff of nightmares. A spokesman for the village from where Jahrah lived said that recently some of the villagers had spotted an even bigger python in the area. They estimated that it was at least 27 feet long and had tried to capture it, but it managed to get away. It slithered off into the surrounding forest. Naturally, the locals are concerned that there are such huge snakes living in the forests around their homes. But attacks like this are becoming increasingly common. Although in the grand scheme of things they are a rare occurrence, they are happening more often than before. The reticulated pythons can grow to enormous lengths, but their typical prey is usually much smaller than a human. Often, they prey on pigs and deer or rodents around nesting birds. But with their habitat in sharp decline, they have nowhere to go. They are in direct competition with humans for some of their food sources too. And as their habitat becomes more and more fragmented, they sometimes need to pass through civilization to make their way from one forested area to the next. Human settlements also offer enticing food for these snakes. Rats and domesticated livestock are always within close proximity to people. And whilst humans wouldn't normally be on the menu, the snake's opportunistic nature makes them a formidable predator, though one we should respect, because if we don't, we may just meet our terrifying final affliction.